we have a sterling speaker up next. He's been Her Majesty's Chief Inspector for 4.5 years now, and in that time, Sir Michael has been a strong force at the helm of the school's inspectorate, Ofsted. He shook things up from the off. In his time, he's led a shift away from contractor inspectors through to having more practitioners inspecting in classrooms. There's been a change in the way that lessons are graded. He's repeated over and over again that he wants more mavericks and great leaders, and he said that he doesn't want to see one way of teaching in the classroom. In recent weeks, as he's been growing more and more outspoken, we've heard him talk about specific issues, northern schools, high ability children, and also children who are being educated in illegal and unregistered schools. That said, he hasn't always been loved. There are some comments that he made at the beginning of his tenure in particular around teachers leaving at 3 p.m, around how head teachers needed to be like Clint Eastwood, and allegedly that if all staff are unhappy, that's how a head teacher knows they're doing the right thing. Although I have to say, he cornered me earlier to say he definitely never said that, and I must stop saying it. One thing we cannot take away from him is that he did nearly 30 years as a head teacher. He is just a few months away now from stepping down in the chief inspector role, and there have been significant achievement made in that time. Whichever of these two stories you agree with, the controversialist, the leader, the maverick, or the person who's just done a lot to change around the school inspector, he is here now to speak to you. Please welcome to the stage Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, Sir Michael Wilshaw.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again to the festival organisers for inviting me. I think this is the third or fourth time I've been here and always thoroughly enjoyed the occasion. So thank you to the sponsors and, of course, to the Master of the College for inviting me yet again. And you never know, Laura, I might have a legion of fans out there. And they're all going to come forward as soon as I step down in a few months' time to say that I was always your fan, Sir Michael. But we wait and see on that one. But I'm here to talk really about the achievement of poor children in our country, as was trailed earlier today. And it's good to speak on this momentous day in British history, when the decision to stay or leave the European Union will have a profound effect on the future of our country. I do hope, though, when the decision is made and the dust settles, people will see that despite the sound and fury, those on both sides of the argument have spoken with passion for what they truly believe. In the same way, I hope that when my term of office ends in a few months' time, people will understand that what I've said and done has been motivated by a passionate desire to improve the lives of children and young people. If I've stirred up emotions from time to time and caused offence by speaking bluntly, then I apologise. But I have been a chief inspector in a hurry, impatient to bring about improvement through inspection. I leave office knowing that although our inspection frameworks are now tougher and more demanding than 5 years ago, many more children are in good and outstanding schools than ever before. I do hope that this is recognised by those who have, from time to time, questioned my approach and sometimes taken my words completely out of context. Our education system is miles better than it was 20 years ago when Ofsted came into being. And each year since, we've seen incremental improvement. And like all schools improve incrementally, our state education system likewise. Our primary schools in particular are doing well, although there is much to do in many of our secondary schools, particularly in the North and the Midlands. So why is our education system still mediocre by international standards and not up there with the best? Quite simply, it's because we have largely failed to address the long tail of underachievement in our country, containing most of our poorest children. This one constituency has not felt the benefits of the improvements I've just mentioned. The boats have not lifted for all children. And the irony is not lost on me saying this in a school like this, bedecked with privilege, with the opportunities that are often denied our poorest youngsters. The lot of disadvantaged children in primary schools has improved, but only a bit. But in secondary schools, the attainment gap between children on free school meals and their better-off peers has refused to budge in a decade. Despite all our good intentions, the fine words, and some imaginative initiatives, we're not making a real difference to these youngsters. The needle has barely moved. In 2005, the attainment gap between FSM and non-FSM pupils in secondary schools was 28 percentage points. It's still 28 percentage points now. Our failure to improve significantly the educational opportunities of the poor disfigures our school system. It scars other achievements. It stands as a reproach to all of us in education. Not long after I started my time at Ofsted, we published a report entitled Unseen Children, which looked at the increasing invisibility of underachieving poor pupils as they progress through our schools, not just in urban areas, but also in isolated rural and coastal communities. We wanted to understand why a majority of disadvantaged children consistently underachieved at school. As I approach the end of my tenure, I'm returning once more to that theme. I spoke earlier in the year about the widening gap between the performance of schools, particularly secondary schools in the north and the south. But as I stand in these glorious grounds at this college, in this beautiful corner of Berkshire, I wonder how many people realise just how badly the poorest pupils have been let down in some of the wealthiest parts of the country. The attainment gap between FSM and non-FSM secondary school children in West Berkshire, this part of the world, is 31 percentage points. In Kent, it's 34 points. In Surrey, it is 36. In Buckinghamshire, it's 39. And in Reading, it's a whopping 40 percentage points, all far in excess of the national gap of 28. What an appalling injustice. And yet, alarming as these figures are, they do not reveal the full extent of our failure. They hide the continuing underperformance of white working class children. For instance, or the dashed hopes of too many of the most able disadvantaged children whose early promise is often left to wither and die. As a teacher who has spent his professional life working in some of the most deprived areas of the country, I find our failure perplexing and also infuriating. I know individual schools across the country have turned things around, particularly in London, and managed to give children who had been written off a good education. But why have we failed at a system and national level? Why haven't we made progress? Why do we keep letting down our poorest children in large parts of the country? And to my mind, there are 5 culprits. The first are the political ideologues of both the left and the right. The poor have often been caught in the crossfire between these two ideologies for as long as I can recall. Of course, both claim to be acting in the interests of the disadvantaged, yet neither accepts the damage they invariably inflict, in different ways. The left's brand of snake oil was very pervasive in the 70s and 80s when I started teaching and became a head for the first time. They infiltrated scores of local authorities, peddling their anti-academic nonsense and undermining the authority and respect of school leaders. I know I've talked about this before, but the reason I keep returning to the subject is that their irresponsible, ideological agenda ruined the education of hundreds of thousands of our poorest children. Children, now in middle age, whose literacy levels are worse than their parents and their grandparents. I've been criticised for saying that school leaders should be battle axes and bruisers. But in the 70s and 80s and some of the 90s, head teachers who wanted to stand against this destructive tide had to be educational warriors. It was only those who were prepared to do this, to stand up to the ideological bullies, masquerading as pastoral reformers, who survived in that terrible period. Many didn't. I well remember, for example, an experienced and respected head teacher in Newham, where I was a head, who was quite simply broken by his experiences of dealing with endless militancy in his school in the mid-1980s, with insults being thrown at him when he refused to allow staff to join the demonstrations during school time to support the miners' strike. And there were many others who experienced similar situations. The middle classes, of course, could escape, and they could escape to the remaining grammars and independent schools. The poor had no such option. They had to endure the chaos, the indifferent teaching, and threadbare curriculum that passed for education in many state schools at that time. They and we are still living with the consequences. Those who are fundamentally opposed to the academy programme should remember why it happened in the first place. Academies were a response to the failure of so many local authorities. They let down the very children they were supposedly supporting. The market-based, laissez-faire approach of the right can equally damage the chances of the poor. Schools will wither on the vine, as they did 20 or 30 years ago, if a more liberal and autonomous system is not subject to strong central and local intervention when early decline sets in. The market will not stop the strong getting stronger and the weak getting weaker. Teachers and leaders will always gravitate to the places where it is more attractive, like London, comfortable, more leafy, and easier to work. The figures for teacher training speak for themselves to exemplify this point. The prosperous South East region has over 458 trainee teachers per 100,000 pupils. Yet the East Midlands manages only 362 per 100,000 pupils. The East of England fares even worse, with only 294 per 100,000 pupils. No wonder these last two regions are poorly performing. Schools in these areas find it more difficult to get good staff because when they leave their training institutions, they don't tend to go to those areas. Teacher supply follows well-resourced demand, not educational need. Hastily rebranded schools in deprived areas soon find that the magic of the market hasn't eradicated underlying problems. But when they fail, as so many do, it is the system or reactionary leftists or those old hippies at Ofsted that are to blame. Free marketeers forget, or perhaps they never cared to think, that without the semblance of a strategy, without meaningful accountability or early intervention, the system risks repeating all the mistakes of a few years ago. They forget that it's easy to destroy a school and so much harder to build one up. And once again, it is the poor who pay the price. The second group that's hobbled the poor is that of the structural vandals, those who argue that children don't need structure in school. In educational establishment circles, it was argued in the 70s and 80s, and still is in some quarters, that structure stifles. It kills childhood creativity. It dictates mindless conformity. This argument rears its head most often today in the endless whines about petty uniform rules or the insistent shriek that testing is inhumane. And again, it is the poor who bear the consequences. Many middle-class children, of course, are less reliant on structure in the school and in the classroom. They get implicit support and direction at home, but many of the poorest children don't. A rule-based classroom culture helps to compensate for a chaotic home life. Take it away, and the poorest children rarely swim, they sink. And even when home structures are in place, the poor's expectations and potential are often constrained by limited cultural horizons. Through no fault of their own, many simply aren't aware of what is possible. And why should they be? Few of them have had access to the life-enhancing opportunities a good education brings. Middle-class children always get a good head start. Their cultural hinterland is rich. Their parents are usually well-educated. they tend to do well in school. And when they don't, their parents can always hire a tutor. And to those who bleat about the tyranny of testing, let me say this. Testing is not a burden. It's an opportunity. It allows teachers to know where a child stands and what help they need. It gives the poor a passport to the prospect of a better life. Weak-head teachers often complain about testing, but in my experience, a good head never tells colleagues to teach to the test. They insist on good teaching, which invariably leads to good results. The tests take care of themselves. We can see what happens to progress when there aren't tests. It's one of the reasons why there's such a gap in attainment between key stages 2 and 4. It's the reason why I've called for a return to testing at key stage 3, so the poor in particular can benefit from formal assessment. Take testing and exams away, and the poor can't rely on the cultural capital or family connections that middle-class children possess. The irresponsibility of the anti-testing lobby in this regard is truly breathtaking. It is the disadvantaged who suffer from their thoughtless crusade. The third culprit is our continuing failure to develop a curriculum pathways for those youngsters who want a strong route into an apprenticeship, especially after the age of 14. But let me be clear, you will find no stronger supporter of a core curriculum and strong literacy and numeracy program than me. I was insisting on the primacy of subject knowledge and the importance of an academic bedrock when many latter-day evangelists were negotiating their way round a wagon wheel. Nor have I ever made the mistake of thinking that the poor wouldn't benefit from access to the canon, to that rich corpus of knowledge that underpins all learning. The poor have as much right to and capacity to appreciate the works of Shakespeare, Newton, and Austen and Macaulay as their better-off peers. This I do not dispute. Well, what about those youngsters who would benefit from a technical education? What about those employers who year after year say that school leavers are not equipped with the technical skills that they're crying out for? And the figures are shocking. In the UK as a whole, there are now 210,000 vacancies as a consequence of skill shortages across the economy, an increase of 43% from 2013. In key sectors such as manufacturing, construction, and utilities, over 30% of vacancies exist because there aren't enough people with the right skills to fill them. I've taught in disadvantaged communities for most of my life, and I can tell you that there will always be some children who will respond better to a technical curriculum than others. The consequences of an inflexible curriculum are plain to see. We see it in the demotivated youngsters who leave school with few relevant qualifications and an antipathy to learning. We see it in the ranks of the unskilled unemployed. We see it in the hundreds of thousands of skilled vacancies that go unfilled and are eventually filled from abroad. We see it in the 40% of youngsters who don't get 5 good GCSE exams. The fourth reason why the poor continue to languish at the bottom of the educational pile is that they're often lumbered with the worst teaching. Despite excellent initiatives such as Teach First, poor communities are still more likely to have less access to good teaching than better off ones. According to the Social Market Foundation, schools in deprived areas are more likely to have fewer experienced teachers, more likely to have teachers without formal teaching qualifications, more likely to have teachers without degrees in relevant subjects, and more likely to have higher teacher turnover than schools elsewhere. Unsurprisingly, these problems have been exacerbated as teacher recruitment becomes more difficult. Last year, Ofsted's own annual report acknowledged that recruitment was toughest for schools in the poorest areas. A recent snapshot survey my inspectors carried out of secondary schools in Kent and Medway has found out that the situation is at least as grave now as it was then. The problem in Kent is compounded by selection. As you know, The proportion of FSM-eligible children attending selective schools nationally is only 3%, way below the national figure of 15%. Yet many of the good and outstanding schools in Kent are grammars. And according to research from Education Data Lab, grammar schools in this area are more likely to attract and retain many of the best teachers in Kent. As a result, secondary schools in Kent with the most disadvantaged children have more unqualified and less experienced teachers. They're also less likely to be judged good or outstanding for teaching, learning, and assessment. Kent is an example of what happens to the poor nationally when market forces predominate. As heads of non-selective schools told our inspectors, the few good teachers that there are prefer to go to the grammars, and we end up having to appoint unqualified or less experienced teachers. This places just more and more demands on experienced staff, while another said there are just no incentives for teachers trained in Kent to stay in Kent and teach in the more challenging schools. As I said earlier, the lack of a national strategic approach to teacher training means that there are challenging areas of the country without ready access to the best newly qualified teachers. Outstanding schools train and retain the best candidates, leaving schools where the need is greatest to scramble for the rest. In Kent, as in the rest of the country, challenging schools are finding it increasingly difficult to recruit good staff. We can roll out as many new, shiny, well-intentioned education initiatives as we like, but if we don't have the people to carry them out, the disadvantage will remain where they are at the bottom of the heap. The same is true of leadership, the final culprit, the final reason why we continue to let down the poor. It's our inability to deliver strong leadership to those who need it most. The poor disproportionately attend schools that are strangers to good leadership. Yet we know that good teaching can only thrive when leadership is strong. Why have we not given greater priority to developing good leadership in our country, particularly in the most difficult areas? Why has the National College for Teaching and Leadership fallen on such hard times? Is the Talented Leaders Programme enough to meet the needs of our country? As things stand, only 6% of schools in the most prosperous areas of England have leadership and management that are judged less than good by Ofsted, just 6%. In the most deprived areas, almost 4 times as many schools, 23%, suffer the same. Unless we resolve to get more of our best leaders into the most challenging schools, the poor will continue to be shortchanged. We don't have to dig too deep to understand why we failed our poorest children. We can see it for ourselves in increasing alienation, the bitter resentment as others arrive to do the jobs the badly educated cannot do. Blame the parents, say some. Blame the immigrants, say others. When we really should blame ourselves, because it doesn't have to be like this. We should start by refusing to patronize the poor. There is nothing wrong in insisting on school structure. We should be tough on feckless parents who allow their children to break the rules. I appreciate that many of them were let down by the education system themselves, but they need to be constantly reminded through letters, meetings, and, if necessary, sanctions, that the way they bring up their children has a profound implication for all of us and for society. We should have a curriculum that not only has a strong core, and I believe in that, but is flexible enough to meet the needs of those youngsters who want a technical pathway. The government should insist that every major multi-academy trust should have a university technology college in it, or 2. Every multi-academy trust should be inspected to ensure that the university technology college does not become a dumping ground for the difficult or disaffected, and that it delivers high-quality pre-apprenticeship programs to the age of 19. And finally, The government must do more to direct good people into the most challenging areas. There have been some laudable initiatives of late, but they have been late, small and piecemeal. I came into teaching, above all, to make a difference to the lives of the poorest. As Chief Inspector, I have attempted to show how the educational underperformance that blights the lives of disadvantaged pupils in reality beggars all of us in our society. Of course the poor suffer the worst consequences, but we are all the poorer for the missed opportunities and wasted potential. We know that it does not have to be this way. We know that their life chances would be greatly improved if they had the best teachers, the best leaders, and a better curriculum. And as I begin my last few months at Ofsted, it saddens me immeasurably to say frankly that we're still letting down our poorest children. And if things don't change fundamentally, we will continue to do so. Thank you.
For the remaining time, what we will do is take some questions from the floor. There are roving microphones, and I'll do my best to sort of field questions as I can. I'm going to take 2 to start with. If you can say your name and where you're from, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Sir Michael. I'm Derek Trimmer, Executive Head Teacher of Swale Academies Trust in Kent Secondary, with 1 outstanding and 2 schools currently. My question really picks up on the level of accountability that you talked earlier on. And we, as a multi-academy trust, the lines of accountability are very, very clear and allow us to have strong impact on our work very clearly. We're also a teaching school, one of our outstanding school, where sometimes the lines of accountability in terms of the work that one can undertake are perhaps less clear, and sometimes the work nationally, as a consequence of that, is less easy to see the impact. I wonder, do you think, given the white paper and the lessons that have come out from it, that there is a time of change happening here, that the work of multi-academy trusts, and perhaps something is going to evolve from that, that might in the future displace the work of teaching school alliances?
And a lady at the front here as well, and then I'll try and move back for the next one.
Julie Robinson, Independent Schools Council. So, Michael, what do you see as sort of solutions to this attainment gap? And do you think the National Teaching Service and collaboration between sectors could be part of the solution?
Great, thank you. So 2 questions. One is around teaching schools and accountability, and the other around the attainment gap and national teaching services. What do we think?
Yeah. Well, I'm a strong supporter of a teacher-led system. It's going to happen, it is happening, and in a few years' time, it will cover the whole country through federations, trusts, and MATs. It's the best way forward. The best head should run a variety of different schools and achieve good performance in the constituent schools within those federations and trusts. The big question is, have we got enough good people to do that? And we know from Ofsted evidence that we don't. We do in some parts of the country, the most attractive parts of the country, London in particular, but we do not have enough good head teachers of individual schools, and we certainly don't have enough chief executives to run good trusts, particularly in difficult areas. And if we're going to replace teaching school alliances with the sort of trust that you're running, fine, as long as we've got people who know how to do it well. And when I talked about leadership a moment ago in my speech, we desperately need a leadership college which not only prepares good people for headship, but good people who are already running good schools to take on a variety of different ones, particularly in tough areas. So that's a big challenge for our country. And the second question was on
Attainment gap.
the attainment gap. Well, why is it that we haven't made any headway over the last 10 years in closing the gap? What is it that's stopping us? You know? And it is a scourge. It is a stain on our education system. And unless heads prioritise this, and unless government prioritises this in the ways that I've described, it'll stay the same. And certainly Ofsted, in my time, has given it a high priority. You know, we're going to be tough on schools that don't put the attainment gap there at the top of the list in terms of school priorities. We're going to be tough on schools that don't use the pupil premium well. But it really is down to head teachers to make sure that poor children are given a good deal, and particularly poor children who are able children. You know, one of the shocking statistic that came from the Sutton Trust last year, which said that 7,000 of the most able children from disadvantaged background who got the top grades at the end of Key Stage 2 failed 5 years later when they got to GCSE. They were outside the top 25% of grades at GCSE, is a terrible statistic. It's really up to head teachers to prioritise and not just be worried about getting over that threshold of 5 HSCs or getting an average score in the Progress 8 measures. We've got to make sure that our poorest, because if you prioritise that, you know other groups are doing well if you do.
Can I ask, why do you think then, in the past 10 years, it hasn't moved very much? Because we've had a period of a lot of money, had a period of a lot of change, and yet things still haven't been different.
Laura. You know why, Laura. You tell me, and I'll tell you.
I really don't.
You don't?
I didn't apply for your job. No, I don't.
Well, I'll tell you why. It's because as a head, and you've got lots of heads in this audience here, you're going to get a decent Ofsted result, probably, if your overall scores are pretty good. If you're going to get over those various thresholds. The HMI inspecting the school will say, well, what are you doing for poor children? The gap seems to be quite wide here. Their scores aren't very good. And the head teacher will say, yes, we know that's a target for us in the future. But look at our overall scores and where we've come from in the last few years. And they get a good judgment. And they're left alone for the next 5 years, you know. So that's why it happens. Blame us, if you like, for not failing more schools who don't do well by their poorest children. But then we would have about 60-70% of schools that are less than good in the country. And what message would that give?
And do you think the more frequent inspections, even though they're shorter, will start to galvanise people then?
I think it will. And I hope my successor will focus on it in the way that I've done and be tough on those schools that consistently underperform with their poorest children.
And when people say, some people argue that they would rather Ofsted didn't exist and you could move to a peer review system or a data-only system, do you think that impetus which Ofsted gives would disappear then?
Well, Ofsted is a key driver for school improvement. I wish I could say that a peer review system and a less formal accountability structure would work. I don't think it would. Ofsted, over the last 20 years, has enormously driven improvement in our system. Every head teacher, good, mediocre, and indifferent, always know that we're around the corner to hold them accountable. The good head, the outstanding head, never really worries much about Ofsted because they know they're doing a good job. But the ones that are doing a mediocre job always worry about what Ofsted is going to say, and it's driven improvement. So peer review might be 100 years away, but it's not going to be around in the next few, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Let's get a couple more questions then from the audience. I need to get out of this light just so I can see. There's a gentleman over there in a blue shirt, a lady in some glasses straight after, and then we'll get someone from the middle as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Steve Cozy. I'm from a school in Hampshire. Year after year, Ofsted and the government bang on about apprenticeships and the fact that there is a skill shortage in this country. What really makes me mad as an apprentice before I came into teaching is this constant banging on about the skill shortage. What can Ofsted do to narrow that gap? Because the apprentice system in this country is dictated by employers, and they're not giving out apprenticeships to our poorest children. They're making it very difficult. A barista, in my opinion, is not a proper apprenticeship for a young person to undertake. What about building? What about the building skills that we've lost in the 1970s and 80s because of governments, because of the education system? What can we do as educators to turn that around and stop being criticised that we are not doing enough at schools?
Thank you. Lady back there.
Hello, my name is Sarah Kingham. I work 2 days a week as an early years advisor, and I've also set up a social enterprise enabling all children to enter school as reading equals. So Michael, I don't know if I'm the only one in the room thinking this, but as research from Save the Children Fund, Read On, Get On states, the poor 3-year-old is already 18 months behind his better off peer. So surely the investment we have to make is in the early years, and particularly in children's emotional attachment, because that's what sometimes is the key driver to success in later life, how good you feel about yourself and how emotionally attached you are to your main carer.
And there was someone just there on the aisle. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Philip Wagstaff from Lymington. My question is in regards to Progress 8. You suggested that there needs to be a bigger variety of courses available for perhaps low achieving students. But Progress 8 wouldn't fall under Progress 8. So would you change the criteria for Progress 8 to include those, to encourage schools to enable them to perhaps provide those courses for the poorer students or the lower attaining students?
Thank you. Great. So there's 3 questions there, and actually the first two, first and last, apprenticeships and Progress 8 probably link quite nicely.
Yeah, who asked the question on apprenticeship?
Steve.
Steve? Did you read our apprenticeship report about 6 months ago? Did you read that one? Well, you'll have seen from that important report that we were incredibly critical. It's one of the most critical reports that we've ever written on what was happening in apprenticeships and the low-level apprenticeships that were being offered, jobs that really should never have been called apprenticeships. The government is committed to, 3 million over the next 5 years, apprenticeships. That's a laudable commitment, as long as they're of high quality, as long as they ensure that employers are engaged, and as long as we have a training system in this country, including schools, that help those youngsters to get onto those apprenticeship programs. And in my speech, I've tried to say that I think what we do at Post 14 is not good enough for youngsters who want to go into apprenticeships. And that's why I'm a big supporter of university technology colleges, joining MAT, being part of a MAT, looking at the 14 to 19 curriculum, a strong core, English, maths and science, and developing youngsters' technical skills so they're well prepared to go into an apprenticeship. That's where it's going wrong. So I agree with you. It's a mess, and it needs to get a lot better if that government target is going to be achieved, and achieved if we get good, strong apprenticeship programs. Early years, again, you'll know what Ofsted has said about early years. We know that the poorest youngsters are 19 months behind their peers by the time they start school. But you know, we've got the 2-year-old free offer. But we also know that 50-60% of parents don't take up that offer. What's the point of providing those subsidies if poor parents don't use them? And it's absolutely critical, and the early years report is going to come out in the next 2 or 3 months. We'll say, why isn't this money being used? What is the local authority doing about this? What are health workers doing to persuade poor parents to take advantage of that offer? And why aren't we expanding? Because we know the best early years provision is in school, in nurseries, in schools. We know that's where poor youngsters are most likely to achieve. Why aren't we expanding nursery provision in primary schools, in infant schools, in the poorest areas, and incentivizing heads to expand their provision in those communities, so that those poor children can be tracked all the way through into reception, into Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 and beyond. And I would appoint, and it was in our Access and Achievement report, somebody at the local authority. I know local authorities aren't popular with government. Somebody's got to do it in the local authority to track the progress of poor children from each stage of their education, from early years to post-16. And the last one was...
On Progress 8, and it links to the
Yeah.
UTCs, because UTCs in particular are having a problem, which is that if they focus on vocational training, or they're not giving all of the GCSEs or qualifications that would fit into Progress 8, they might well see their data hit quite heavily. Obviously, they're very afraid of you coming
I'm going
in
to
and
kick the
failing
ball
them.
into the government's court on this one. You know, if we're going to really, really make sure UTCs work, really make sure those 40% of youngsters who currently fail in the system and often fail in the FE sector, I have to say. I know I'm not popular in the FE sector, but they fail, too often they fail in the FE sector. That ball is now in the government's court to ensure that the accountability measures and Progress 8 can accommodate high-quality vocational programs.
What are the barriers that you hear when you say things to the government about early years funding or about more vocational pathways?
Barriers is that they don't listen.
Are there reasons that they give about why they're not listening, though, or do they just fob you off?
Well, that's the whole point of Ofsted, isn't it? You know, Ofsted is about shining a spotlight on what we think is going wrong and what's going right, and making recommendations to government. That's Ofsted's job. That's what Ofsted has always done. That is why it's important we're impartial. That's why it's important that we're independent. And if you look at all the reports we produced over the last 5 years in my tenure, we have made key recommendations in all those reports. It's up to government then to look at it, listen and act.
I think we've only got a few minutes left, and there is a question that when I was asking people earlier what they would like to know, one of the things that came up was, how do you feel about the fact that the person who's been named as the next chief inspector hasn't been a teacher or a head teacher?
I think you can be a good chief inspector without being a teacher, as long as you've got a lot of common sense, you've got a lot of guts, you've got a lot of courage, you're perceptive, and you're prepared to work hard.
And do you know Amanda Spielman?
I know, I've met her a number of times. When I was Director of Education for ARC, she was obviously there in the early days setting up the organisation and bringing in the sponsor and doing a lot of research. So I've met her a few times.
And what's your thoughts?
Yeah, best of luck to her. But yeah, my thoughts are is that, you need, as I said, you need common sense, you need ability to work hard, be perceptive, and challenge the system to do better. I hope I've done that in my time as Chief Inspector.
And then the final thing, earlier on, poor Sir Michael was getting off the train earlier and I was getting off the same train, and so he had to put up with me for a 20-minute walk up here. And one of the things he said to me at the time is that I had repeated several times a story about the fact that he once said that you're not doing everything right unless your staff are unhappy. And this is something that's quite controversial, and every time it gets mentioned, it gets lots of people very het up. And you said to me, it was the first thing you said when I walked over, you said, I never said that. That isn't correct. And you would like the proper version told.
This
so here
is the last time I'm going to say this. I never said that. This was well before I joined Ofsted. It was a talk I was giving to head teachers who were in challenging areas, many of whom were working in underperforming and special measures schools. And I talked to them about my experiences. And I read out a letter from a teacher I'd taken to task who was incompetent and not doing their job properly. And the letter from this teacher to me was saying what an awful man I was, A, and B, that the staff in the school, that morale in the school, staff morale was low. And a throwaway comment from me at the time was, if somebody says to you, staff morale is low, you know you're doing something right. Because actually I was doing absolutely the right thing in tackling that teacher and 2 or 3 others or more in the school who were letting the school down. It wasn't the whole staff, but it was a way of me saying to head teachers doing a difficult job and a lonely job, because they are very much on their own in that situation, you'll face some of those accusations when you go into these schools. And you've got to, if you think you're doing the right thing and you're tackling underperformance amongst children as well as staff, you need to keep to that course. That was the only thing that I said.
So do you believe that?
No, of course, good staff morale, of course that's important. Because sometimes you can only get to that point when you sort out the minority of people on the staff who are letting the staff down, who will use that as a means, the accusation as a means of getting you to change your mind in terms of tackling underperformance.
And given this is the last time you're going to be speaking on our stage at Festival as the Chief Inspector, is there one thing you would like people to go away and remember you by?
I just hope that they believe that Ofsted has been, never mind me as Chief Inspector, but Ofsted has been a powerful driver for school improvement, institutional improvement, and I hope they believe that I've acted with integrity and with the best motives.
Thank you. Everybody, for the last time today, Sir Michael Wilshaw, thank you very much.